Hi everyone, welcome. So I am here on behalf of quite a large team. This was a 2.5-year project led by Dan Lubman at Turning Point, and also Nerily Hing and David Hodgins, who are both here at this conference. So this grant, funded by Gambling Research Australia, oh, here's David Hodgins. I was just talking about you. So this was funded by Gambling Research Australia, and as I said, it was a 2.5-year project. So what I'm going to do today is just sort of give you a bit of background to it, and then look very briefly at the results of 2.5 years worth of work. To give you a flavour for it, because the report is 300 or 400 pages, and so maybe you get really enthusiastic today and go, oh, where can I get that report? So when we're talking about self-help, we're talking about those individual strategies and actions that people do to change their own gambling. So avoid carrying extra cash to venues is an example of something you might hear quite regularly, right? So everyone's heard of that. Clearly, I mean, usually the picture doesn't look like that, which I personally think is quite funny. I made that. So self-help, while we're talking about it, is the most widely used type of help amongst gamblers, but it's also the first choice amongst gamblers if a problem has developed. And this has come from Nerily Hing's and colleagues' work some years ago, looking at help seeking. And as a component of that study, they also looked at self-help and found that. We know over many years that people do naturally recover without seeking treatment, but more recently it's become apparent that people don't spontaneously recover. People do things. They engage with resources, they engage with strategies and actions, and so they appear to do things to make that change occur. Surprisingly, there's very little in the literature that has specifically looked at self-help and self-help strategies. David's work some 15 years ago with 43 recovered gamblers involved open-ended qualitative interviews. And in that study, they identified 12 broad actions for change and 13 maintenance actions. So just of these 4 pieces of research, I thought I'd actually show you the tables from that, because it's kind of interesting if you think about where did this all come from. And this was actions people take in order to make that change happen. And you can see things such as stimulus control, avoidance, develop new activities, which were discussed by about 50% of the sample. So this wasn't endorsed, this was what people had talked about in these interviews. And in terms of maintenance, now there's almost no research around what happens after people go through change and then are attempting to maintain that change later on. So this research found just under half of people said that they engaged in new activities and thought about the negative and consequences of the gambling. So that's sort of just a bit of flavour about where this started. And then some 11 years later, Gambling Research Australia commissioned Nerily Hing and colleagues to look at help seeking, and they identified 9 strategies people use. They tested it with a broad sample of regular gamblers, helpline callers and face-to-face clients. Around the same time, Sue Moore and Anna Thomas looked at self-regulation strategies, and they tested 20 of those strategies. And then finally, Max Abbott and Maria here in New Zealand, as part of the National Gambling Survey, looked specifically at 6 methods to limit time or money spent gambling. So what you'll notice across this list is there's not been a lot of consistency in terms of how we describe these things people do to limit or reduce their gambling. So part of our job for this was to define exactly what is self-help, so to put some parameters around this study. So self-help for this project was defined as strategies or actions people use to control or maintain change to their gambling. So in this case, a strategy is like a broad plan, like limit access to cash. And an action would be don't carry cards, only carry cash that you want to spend for the day. We defined it also as something they do themselves without necessarily interacting with others. Now, if you had a strategy of get someone else to look after your money, that clearly involves another person. But the strategy in itself is largely self-administered and under the person's personal control. Some of you might be aware of Neighbour's work, where he looked at the developed a readiness scale. And in his definition, he says that it's non-professionally administered, so there's no professional oversight. So there's not someone checking how is the person doing it, are they doing it right, how is it being implemented. Now, importantly, self-help can be used alone, sequentially or concurrently with other forms of help. So we didn't exclude people if they went on to, if they had other types of help. And what we know through this research is people use self-help before they go to treatment, they use it while they're at treatment, they use it after treatment, and I'll show you a curve later on to show you that they use it a long time after treatment. So there were two phases of this study. The first phase was to gather all the self-help strategies. So if you remember back to that table just before, there were around 20 that had been developed, mainly based on David's work and then Anna. But what we wanted to do was see if we could find a few more. So we went to the literature, and everybody's citing everybody, so that didn't take us a long way. So the next thing we did was narrowly led a study looking at Australian websites. So you can see here that they were help service websites, government websites, gambling websites, and 2 professional websites. And basically they developed an audit tool and then counted up and identified all the different strategies. Anyone want to hazard a guess how many actions came out of that audit? So it's 34 Australian only websites. It's going to take a while. I'm going to point at someone. Sean. 200? Did I tell you this last night? We'll have a look in just a minute. And then at the same time, we did an analysis of a Victorian online forum and that's no longer operational. It was problemgambling.vic.gov. Now, what this forum did, it didn't have an interaction. It was more a blog. So we extracted data that was only talking about strategies for change and success stories. And then we applied the definition of self-help to that and then extracted self-help from that. So there was 133,000 words that we looked at, so it was quite a lot of text just in these 600 posts. And the last thing we looked at was how people talked about self-help in counselling. So this is an example of a website where you might have done this if you did this in New Zealand, and this is the Gambling Helpline website as it stands now, today. And you can see that this is called Self-Help. And it has a few self-help strategies. Mostly it says to get treatment, but it also talks about avoiding venues, developing alternatives and doing some exercise. Across that first phase, you can see here these were the number of strategies we identified and then the number of actions. So it's actually 506 distinct actions that were talked about on Australian websites. So quite a few. So the next step we did was to collapse these actions. And if, Anna, could you, I have a handout of this, so we'll do like a handout. Thanks. Sure. So the next thing we did was to collapse the actions into something that was manageable. And we ended up with a list of 99 individual actions, which I'm handing out now. These were available online in groups of strategies. And the strategies were become informed about gambling, complete a self-assessment, set limits on your own gambling, plan gambling session in advance, manage finances, reduce gambling opportunities, cognitions, monitoring behaviour, alternatives, improving health and wellbeing, social support and faith and prayer. So if we had a little bit more time, perhaps I would get you to go through that list and have a guess what people with problem gambling would endorse most frequently. Would there be any problems with this, you might start to wonder? And So one of the things that we identified was if you only had people with problems do this, you wouldn't start to get an idea about these actions that are listed on all of these websites. So with this phase 2, or this second part of the study, we sought to access a broad population of gamblers, and those with and those without problems. We recruited widely over 2014 and with a great deal of assistance from the Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation, Australian Institute of Family Studies, as well as clubs and pubs and services across Australia that distributed material. We ended up recruiting 700 people to this first study, aged between quite a wide age. They had to have gambled at least once in the last year. We screened with the PGSI and the NODS clip, and the reason we did this was we realised because we had also targeted people that were in recovery, so we had contacted recovery agencies that we knew, we'd gone to 12-step groups and different people like that to try, but mostly groups such as the one in New South Wales and Victoria. And we found that the PGSI didn't differentiate if someone had a problem in the past and if they had never had a problem. So you can see here we asked another item called, have you ever had a problem or concern about your gambling? And that was evenly split between never had a problem in the past and a current problem. We've done some psychometrics around that and it looks to be quite good. Now, 2/3 of the people in this survey had never sought any treatment. So this is just a really high-level snapshot of the data that came out of this. And this was the highest rated actions by people that had tried these items. Now, what you'll notice is that the people without any gambling problems, with which there was around 240, there were people that had, they endorsed quite different items than people that had current or past gambling problems. And I'm happy to discuss why number one might be eat a healthy, balanced diet, but that one's a little bit strange, and the research team was like, why is that number one? What's that got to do with gambling? Is a common question. That was put in there a group of physical health wellbeing items because that had come up in quite a lot of research around self-help for subclinical depression. Now, the top 2 items for people with current or past problems were think about how your money could be better spent and accept that gambling needs to change. In fact, most of the top 20 items for people with current or past problems were cognitive strategies. Now, this is a little bit surprising because most of the information are not about cognitive strategies. In terms of breaking that down a little bit further and looking at the proportion of people that said they were helpful or very helpful, that pattern starts to look a bit different. So to just sort of make it a bit simpler to understand, I thought I'd just choose 2 where there was a significant difference between people without problems and people with current or past problems. And you can see this first one set spending limits for each week or fortnight. People without a gambling problem said that that was helpful or very helpful. People with a past problem, more than half said that was unhelpful or very unhelpful. Now, you can do a search for that and that will come up on just about every early intervention website. Avoid chasing losses, you can see it's quite similar as well. In terms of the lowest rating items of the 99, as might be expected, there are a few in there around talking to a health professional or asking family or friends to support you, and some extreme items such as, giving your cards. And of course, people without problems aren't going to endorse those. You'll notice here that the people with current problems and past problems were a little bit different in terms of their rating items. But again, looking at the proportions that said that rated it as helpful or very helpful, you can see here again there's differences in terms of set up cues to keep track of time while gambling. People with no problems, 55% said that that was helpful or very helpful, whereas people with a past problem, more than 60% said it was not helpful. In terms of stick with my strategy, don't increase or decrease the bet, people without a problem said that was very helpful. People with past problems said that was very unhelpful, the majority, 60%. The second part of this, and I've just got 2 slides on this one, was we realised while we were doing this that, of course, if you ask people if you ever used these strategies, that you're actually getting a lifetime measure of or indicator of using strategies. So what we did was we offered the survey again to people 30 days later and measured their readiness to change, or the stage of change. And we actually got quite a nice split across stage of change. You can see pre-contemplation, contemplation, action and maintenance across the numbers there. And here is a table looking at the top actions, or the uptake of, the highest uptake of these actions across the stage of change. And there's actually a nice sort of pattern going on there, where the people without problems were a little bit similar to the pre-contemplators, and then people in contemplation and action were endorsing different types of actions, and then people in maintenance again were endorsing different actions. But interestingly, the 6th most endorsed item for people in maintenance was eat a healthy, balanced diet. So that one started high, and then as gambling became more involved and people progressed through, it eventually came back again. Now we're actually doing some research here with Max's group and his trial about developing SMS around this, and when you look at the maintenance, they're people up to 20 years, so between 6 months and 20 years, and those actions start to look a whole lot different when you break the data down like that. So if you look 1 year, 4 years, 5 years, it looks quite a lot different. This one is just to give you an idea of how many strategies people use at each stage of change. And you can see here that, of course, as you might expect if you think about it, that action is going to have the most number of actions used. That was unusual, across that stage of change. But I guess what was surprising for us was people were still using these in maintenance, and some years later. So overall, no action was identified that singly effectively dealt with an individual's gambling problem. All participants reported using more than one action, and all participants reported combining actions. So they would combine money with activity, with distraction, and maybe some social support. We're still to do the analysis to look exactly, what that pattern is and there. Similar actions reported as helpful by people with current and past problems, but the people without problems look quite different in terms of what they said was helpful. And uptake differed across the stages. This has implications, and so many implications that I had to cut about 4 of the slides. The first one is that people have access to self-help tips, but they don't really have access to self-help tools. So something that they can use to help them decide what the best thing is in terms of managing their gambling at this stage. It also suggests that we need to review self-help programs for the content that's not useful, particularly if they're, depending on who they're targeting. So if they're targeting people with that are at risk, those programs probably need to look a bit different than people that have problem gambling. We also probably need to review websites, particularly websites that are talking to people with gambling problems or problem gambling and are suggesting that they do things that people say are unhelpful. And we also need to provide information, advice and guidance on implementation. The implementation is kind of interesting in that there's almost no information on it. There is no information on how you transition between actions across the cycle of change. There's no indicator of when the best time is to return cards, for example. There's no indicator of how people disengage with strategies or how they have a carefully planned B. Now, the clinicians in the room would be very familiar with the story of, I gave my cash or my cards to my dad and it didn't work. Well, how long did you do that for? Oh, a week? But this is the problem, right? The self-help strategy is there, but there's no second level. And then there's limited review where strategies should be abandoned. So at what point does someone work out that strategy is not working? When is it no longer required? When should it be replaced? Or when should people step up to some other type of treatment? This is choice, not chance. I thought I'd just give you an example of the local context. You can see here this really fantastic program in New Zealand, but it also does the same sort of thing where it lists a bunch of things you might do about your money, but sort of not that next level. Okay, so what's next? there's clearly an urgent need for training for and guidelines, not just for gamblers, but for health promotion and clinicians. These self-help strategies, and correct me if I'm wrong, but these would be routinely used while someone is attempting therapy as well. We don't know about the generalisability of this. Faith and prayer was actually cut from that list you just saw because it was so infrequently endorsed in Australia. But when you look at the American websites, it's strongly talked about in the change websites for gambling. We don't know the optimal combination or timing of these actions, and probably one of the biggest issues is while people rated these as helpful, there's no indicator of if they're effective at actually changing their gambling, despite these being routinely offered to people. Yeah, so the report's a little tricky to find on the GRA website, but if you go in there and just pop in self-help, you should bring that up. So I think we've got a little bit of time for questions or comments, right? Super. Hi.
Look, one of the first things you mentioned there was that setting your limits is not very helpful as far as past problem gamblers and current problem gamblers. Mm. So you know how the machines you can set limits and what have you. Is that a waste of time? Is it?
Well, yeah, but this is an issue with this. So we have a lot of information, but we can't say much more than this is what people are saying is helpful at this stage. Right. Would you agree, David? And David, feel free to.
I mean, I wouldn't go that far to say that this is not helpful, but this is how it was perceived.
Okay. Mm. Is there anything overseas to indicate that this presetting on machines is not very helpful? No. To your knowledge? No.
I get.
The limited evidence is that people who could benefit from it cannot do it.
Okay.
Mm. I guess the other issue is I think the sample was around 70% EGM gamblers, but there's still a high proportion of online and wagering gamblers in there. And of course, the next step needs to be breaking this down by type of gambling as well. Mm.
Another question. The spiritual thing, is that GA? Is that really what that was saying? GA isn't that helpful?
No, so Gamblers Anonymous, self-exclusion are tricky ones, firstly about whether they're self-help or not. And as a research team, we argued a lot about their inclusion, and I think they actually were in the study, but then we took them out at the end. Because they're programs, and so the spirituality items were, I think it was hand over to a higher power and attend church, but it was so frequently endorsed. But there wasn't really a pattern in the US data. You probably have to go into it, but they certainly talked about handing over to God a lot.
Because AA is so strongly endorsed, even here, and yet GA is struggles.
Mm. Yep, thank you.
I was just thinking about what you were commenting about with the 7 minutes and pre-commitment, which is what you're talking about. And maybe it probably depends on the way it's set up. So if you set it up under a partial system or voluntary system, it's probably not going to be that. And the research today suggests that's not going to be that helpful for people who are struggling with problems because they can actually take themselves out of the system or override those limits. But the whole point about the limit setting, it's in a full system where everyone has to take part, has to set a limit. You set it in the cold light of day. So when you've decided this is what I want to do, this is the limit I want to set, and then it's actually, it takes time for you to reset that limit. So when you're in the venue, then you can't override that limit at that time. So it may be that it's actually becomes a helpful strategy in that scenario, whereas at the moment in Australia that's not the case. So you can
in New Zealand you can set it and you get a stand down probably for up to a week before you can go and reset it.
Yeah. So it may be, I mean,
yeah.
We did some research a little while ago where there was a thing around the messages around setting limits.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because what people were saying was that the messages around setting limits, so whether they're problem gamblers, so we're kind of looking at the continuing part, whether they're problem gamblers are saying that's not relevant to them because they'll just go beyond that. Do you think that what you found is sort of partly saying that it's just not relevant rather than unhelpful? Because I was trying to get, we were trying to get that distinction and the thing that we looked at messaging as well. So does it just a relevant message to them, or does it have the opposite effect?
Yeah, I think, yeah, thanks Hannah. I think this really raises some issues in terms of how you get to the next level of this data. So we did 30 interviews with people that were part of this study, and we asked them about the strategies that they used and, you know, implementation challenges, what worked, what didn't, what was the barriers, facilitators. But what we ended up with, because people use so many of them, that we ended up with one or two people talking about this one person talking about that one or two people talking about this one. And so perhaps you just, I don't know what you do with this, whether you draw a line under the top 30 and then you just do that. But I guess, like, you know, thinking about this, you don't do one face-to-face study and say, super, we've sorted out face-to-face treatments. Like, this is the first and the biggest study ever to be done on this, and it just raises so many questions that, you know, it would be good to think about. Yeah.
Just late in the weekend, I might be a little bit slow on the uptake. This process is totally a personal, individual process and has no counselling
Correct.
element to it.
Correct. And thank you, actually. That's another thing we grappled with, is some of the cognitive strategies, I think, aren't promoted as self-help because they're seen as counsellors' domains, but people talk about doing it. So how do we help people do it better, I guess, without having to see a counsellor?
I'm sure I tried at least 10 of those processes before I went for help.
And did they fail, which is why you ended up seeking help, or did they help you develop your confidence to get help?
I think it's a recognition early that you've got a problem. You try and fix it yourself until you get to the stage where you just realise you can't do it. But I'm sure that in that section you realise I can't do this myself. Where do I go?
And it's such a good point, because part of the issue might be we're not training people how to do this well themselves. There is no information on how to implement these well. So how do we expect people to know how to do that? They struggle along and they do the best that they can.
You've got a group of people, I've got myself, and I know that wouldn't have worked with me.
Yeah.
Those in the longitudinal study, some of those measures that people took actually were predictors of developing a problem, because we're actually studying people over time. That doesn't mean to say that they weren't effective, but just mean probably the people that were starting to lose control actually were trying to get control using different techniques.
Yeah.
But there was one, I can't remember what the hell it was, that actually was associated with not relapsing or not having persistent problems.
Yeah, right.
There was one strategy that looked like it was helpful in maintaining non-gambling or reduced,
Yeah. Wow.
So, but maybe it would be good to embed this in those sorts of longitudinal studies.
Yeah. Great.
These are cross-sectional, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right, exactly. And you had a...
You mentioned setting time-based cues as something that non-gamblers thought would be helpful, but actual gamblers said, no, that's not helpful. Why do you suppose that is? Is it just, do they not see them, or do they just like hitting the snooze button over and over again before you actually get out of bed? It's too easy to ignore them or to set it off till later?
I think it comes back to, I wouldn't like to make an assumption about why they're saying that. So it's actually their perception of how helpful it was. So now, one of the things we did do for this this presentation that is different than the report, we only reported helpfulness for people that used the strategy. So the data looks a little bit different if you report it for everybody, whether or not they used it or didn't use it, because you have to arguably use a strategy in order to decide whether it was helpful or not. Yeah, yeah. But I think that's time, isn't it, Nellie?